So, what Pastor Josh forgot to say is, welcome to Covenant Community Church, where we exist to equip you, the church, to proclaim Jesus and live out his teachings. Super simple, really easy, but two things we want to do here is we want you to be able to live your life for Jesus in a way that honors Jesus. And it really comes from knowing your word. What does the Bible say? How does it teach us to live? How does it teach us to act? You know, it's not just about acting and living, but we act and live out of response to the love in which we have with Jesus, that relationship that I talked about last week. So, we're diving into this series, Acts, back into it. Paul's traveling back to Jerusalem. If any of you guys remember when Pastor Josh talked like 3 weeks ago, he talked about the elders begging Paul not to leave to go to Jerusalem, and Paul choosing to make the sacrifices to honor God. And Paul decides, I'm going to go to Jerusalem anyways. I know that they don't like me there. I know that the Jews have been persecuting me. They've been hunting me down. And guess where the center of all the Jews are? Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem. No, okay. But the focal point of the Jewish people is Jerusalem. That's their capital. That's their city. And so Paul is traveling literally into the hands of the enemy, the people who want to persecute him. And we find ourselves where Paul is engaging with James the elder. If you guys have remembered through our series, James is the brother of Jesus. Some people say he's the cousin of Jesus. It's a dispute about a certain word. It's language. The word could mean cousin. It could mean brother. We don't really know because it's used in both cases. But James is a family member of Jesus, and he is the head of the church in Jerusalem. He's him along with the elders. And Paul meets with them. He gathers with them, and he engages with them, and they warn him that the Jews have been unhappy with him because he's been converting Gentiles and telling them they don't have to become Jewish. They don't have to convert over to the Jewish laws. So he says, let me give you a solution, Paul, because we have Jewish believers. We're the Jewish church in Jerusalem. He says, let me tell you how to engage with us well. Go to the temple, make a vow. We have 7 men who will go with you, who have all made vows. They've shaved their heads. Go to the temple, purify yourself, so that you can show the Jews in the city that you are, in fact, honoring God. And you're not here to, draw people away from God. Because we believe that Christianity, what they would call at the time the following of the way, believers of the way, was a continuation of the Jewish faith. It wasn't a new faith, a new religion, but it was the fulfillment of all the things that the Jews had hoped for. And so Paul, showing himself that he is in alignment with that belief, does what he does. He goes to the temple, he purifies himself ritualistically, the way that the Bible describes temple purification, and then also the way that the Jewish customs describe purifying yourself. And that's where we find ourselves. He's in the temple, and he gets surrounded because guess who finds him in the temple? Well, you know how Paul's been traveling around Asia, what we call Asia, they would call Turkey, modern-day Turkey area. Well, there's a bunch of Jews who saw him over there and don't like him. Well, guess what? They're visiting Jerusalem, and they see him. They encounter him in the temple, and they cause a commotion. They grab him. People start surrounding him, and they make such a ruckus that it says that the Roman commander, the one who runs the whole garrison of Jerusalem, goes out and takes Paul captive to find out what's happening. And that's where we find ourselves. So Acts 21, verses 37 through 22-29. So if you guys will open up, we're in 21:37. And it says this, and Paul was about to be brought into the barracks. He said to the commander, may I say something to you? And he said, do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago raised a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness. But Paul said, I am a Jew of Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city, and I beg you, allow me to speak to the people. So first things first, why does the commander grab Paul? Well, he thinks that he's causing a riot or rebellion. At this time, around similar times, there's, I forget which city it was, but there's this massive, cliffside with a town, a little fortress at the top of it, where there's this man, he's Jewish, he raises up an army and leads them out. They're assassins, they're what we call the zealots. Leads them out into the wilderness. They hold out in there and they fight against the Romans. And so this commander thinks that Paul is either that man or he's somewhat associated to him, because all the Jews are going crazy. They're yelling, they're rioting, they're screaming, and he doesn't know what's happening. But Paul says, no, let me clear something. I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus. I'm not from Egypt. I'm from Cilicia, and I beg you, let me speak to the people. So he gives Paul permission. This is verse 40. And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hands. And when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. So he speaks Greek to the Greek speakers, and he speaks Hebrew to the Hebrew speakers. So you see Paul, he's allowed outside of the barracks. All the people who are commotioning are following the soldiers and Paul to the barracks. And Paul comes out and he raises his hand like they do, and he silences them. And he speaks, and this is what he says. He says, "Men, brothers, and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even quieter. And he said, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but having been brought up in this city and having been instructed at the feet of Gamaliel according to the strictness of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you are all today." He connects with them. He says, I'm a Jew. I'm raised up in this city just like you guys. I was raised by Gamaliel, and we'll get into who that is in a little bit. And then he says, I'm just like you, zealous for God. He continues. He says, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering both men and women into prisons. And also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to the brothers and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. But it happened that as I was on my way, approaching Damascus about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me. And I fell to the ground, and I heard a great voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. And those who were with me beheld the light to be sure, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What do I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise up and go to Damascus, and there you will be told of all that has been determined for you to do. But since I could not see because of the glory of that light, being led by the hand by those who were with me, I came into Damascus. Now a certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the law and well spoken of by the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing near said to me, Brother Saul, regain your sight. And that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. And he said, The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will, and to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. Now why do you delay? Rise up and be baptized, wash away your sins, and call on his name. Now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and he was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your witness about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to be imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also, by standing by approving and guarding the garments of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And they were listening to him up to this statement, and they raised their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he shall not be allowed to live. And as they were crying out and throwing off their garments and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by flogging, so that he might find out the reason why they are shouting against him that way. But when they stretched him out with leather straps, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? And when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported to him, saying, What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. And the commander came and said to him, Tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, "Yes." And the commander answered, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money." And Paul said, "But I have been born a citizen." Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately withdrew from him. And the commander also was afraid when he learned that he was a Roman, because he had bound him. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in here that I want us to unpack. But first and primarily, I want us to understand that there's power in testimony. What do I mean by that? Well, Paul is in a situation where he's stuck in prison, or he's getting arrested and trying to get thrown into prison. He's in a moment where the Jews are surrounding him to beat him. They're angry, right? They're throwing off their outer coats. They're throwing dust in the air. They're angry. They want to kill him. And what does Paul do? Instead of saying, "Hey, I'm a Roman citizen, protect me," which he could have done to the commander, he says, "Let me speak to them. Let me address them." And he uses his story to emphasize the transformation of what Jesus does in his life. And he does it in a way that has power, that has authority. And it doesn't mention that people got saved. It doesn't mention that people were softened to his testimony. But I'm sure there were. I'm sure there were people that thought about it. There are people who were angry and walked away and thought about it. But we see that God gave him an opportunity to present his testimony. And one thing that we see is one of the prophecies that God gave him is that I will place you before kings and you will tell about me, right? So now we're in a moment where Paul is presented before the commander of the city, the one who's in charge of the army in the city. And he's able to present the gospel, not just to him, but to all the Jews that are surrounding him. So we see that the first point is that life presents us with opportunities, or life presents us with difficulties that can be seen as opportunities, right? Just like Paul, he's in a moment where life is hard. I'm not getting arrested and going to jail, so life's not that hard for me. But there's moments where life's difficult, whether it be adversaries, work complications, relationships are hard. And so dealing with people that are not the friendliest is hard to deal with sometimes. But those difficult moments present us with opportunities in which we can bring about the gospel through testimony, through story. So Paul finds himself in the hands of the Roman commander. He's being questioned about why he's there and why he's having to clean things up for Paul. Why he's causing a ruckus. And Paul asks if he's able to speak to the people. So like Paul, life often throws us curveballs, right? Life oftentimes throws us moments where we're in sucky situations. And it's just kind of how it is. That's life. Moments where we're not expecting, or difficulties or adversities. But like I've been saying kind of throughout this process of the book of Acts, is we can respond in certain ways, right? Our response matters. So when we're faced with difficulties or hard times, the way that we respond is in two ways. We can respond defeated. We can say, that sucks. I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to go mope. Or we can respond by facing it head on like Paul did, right? Paul doesn't hide in the jail. He doesn't say, I'm a Roman citizen, don't hit me, but also don't send me back out there. He says, let me go back out to talk to them, right? He faces it head on. So Paul gives us the example of facing things head on, not running away from them, not hiding from them, but he chooses to go out and to speak to the people. And so for us, when we see moments of difficult times, we can choose to face them head on and make an opportunity for the gospel. The second one is that God gives you a unique story to share that can draw others to Jesus. And that's a really big one, is when we're thinking about how do I share the gospel, right? Paul's in a moment where everyone hates him right now. Probably not the prime time to be sharing the gospel. Or is it? Right? In most people's minds, it's not the best time to be like, all right, guys, I know you guys want to beat me to death, but let me just tell you about Jesus real quick before you hit me. Probably not the best time in our minds, but for Paul, every moment was the best time to share the gospel. Right? Every situation was an opportunity to interject Jesus into the situation or into the conversation. And so God has given each of us a unique life, a unique story, unique positions, unique places of position, of authority, of power, whatever it is. God has given us each a unique story that we can share to draw others to Jesus. Paul says this, he says in his introduction to the people, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but having been brought up in this city, having been instructed at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strictness of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you are all here today. So what does he do first? Paul says, I know you're upset with me. Let me connect with you. Let me show you how we relate. I'm Jewish just like you. I was raised in the same city as you. I was actually mentored by one of your most famous rabbis. Gamaliel is one of the leading rabbis at the time. He's someone that the Jewish people respected highly. We still have some of his writings in the Talmud, the book of rabbis' teachings. Right? Gamaliel is someone famous. And so Paul says, not only am I Jewish like you, not only was I raised in the same city as you, but I was educated by the person you all respect. Not only that, but I lived stricter than you when it came to the law. And I'm zealous for God just like you. He's saying, let's establish how we relate first if we're dealing with this relational issue. Right? You hate me, I don't hate you. But let's establish, how do we relate, right? What is that interconnecting part of our lives that I can use to open up a gospel moment? God's given him a unique position of authority, right? He uses the name Gamaliel. He throws around a name of authority because it causes people to actually listen. What's the response? It says that they begin to hush down because they hear who he is. So, God has given you a unique knowledge, something you know, a skill maybe, a unique job, a position that you have. Maybe it's work, maybe it's a position of authority, or maybe you're under someone who you're having a relational issue with. Maybe it's a boss. I'm just right? There's ways in which we can connect with people, or there's difficulties that happen because of relationships. Because relationships are difficult. But these difficulties present opportunities for us to interject the gospel, for us to share the gospel. And oftentimes we'll find that the things in our life, maybe I have a certain position. When I go to a coffee shop and people say, oh, what are you doing today? Oh, I'm working on church stuff. Oh, what does that mean? Oh, I'm a pastor, right? My position gives me an opportunity to start a conversation with someone. Maybe you're a mechanic, or maybe you drive trucks, or maybe you do X, Y, Z, right? Your ability to have a unique position of work gives you an opportunity to connect with people in a different way, right? Oftentimes when I tell people I'm a pastor and they're not speaking in a way that they would speak around a pastor, they get kind of freaked out and they start changing their language, and I say, you don't have to do that for me. So our position is unique because it connects with people in a certain way. And that's what we see Paul doing, as he connects with people using his unique position, his unique story, his unique part of his life. But we also see a different thing, and that's my third point, is that God gives you a unique testimony of how the gospel has changed your life. So we see that the first part, your unique story, this is, like Paul, the list of how he relates to the people around them. Right? This is how you connect with people. When you're sharing the gospel, like Paul, you need to connect with people. I have a hard time with street preachers simply because they don't connect with people. And it makes it hard for someone to be open to the reception of the gospel. Do I think it's unnecessary? No, I think people need to preach on the street. I think we need people to do that because then people are hearing the gospel. But there has to be people who connect with people on the street, who have a conversation, who sit down with them, who build the relationship as well, because, someone needs to disciple people. And so Paul lists out how he relates to them. We see in the second part that Paul shares his testimony of how God changed his life. And it says this, but it happened that as I was on my way, he says, this is what I was doing. I was on a mission for the high priest and the elders of Jerusalem, on a mission to go arrest believers of the way, right? These are Christians, followers of the way. I'm going to arrest them, I'm going to beat them, I'm going to throw them in jail, and then they're going to punish them. He says, I was on a mission approaching Damascus. He gives details about noontime. And then he says, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me. And I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said to me, 'I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting.'" Why does this matter? Because he gives us credentials. He says, "I was zealous just like you. I wanted to beat these Christians. I even approved of the murder of Stephen." Right? He says, "I was there. You guys threw your coats at my feet and I approved it." He says, "I was this way, but I encountered a moment, and I can't be lying because I wouldn't have changed unless something specific happened to make me change." And he says that thing is what I'm telling you about right now, that this bright light came up, and I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And I answered, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "Jesus the Nazarene." So what he's doing here is he's showing the moment in which God encountered him and his life changed. That's a testimony. A testimony is explaining, one, how you were, what you were doing, and how God interjected that moment, and then how your life changed as a result of that moment. So it's really a story about the encounter you had with God. What is that encounter? And it could be something crazy. Some people have very interesting testimonies. It could be something normal. As I was flipping through the television, I came across TBN or something, and I was like, that sounds pretty good. But there can be so many spectrums of how you encounter Jesus. But Jesus has given you a unique testimony about how the gospel has changed your life. Every single one of you has a different way in how you've encountered God, right? It's not flat out the same for everyone. And so there's people out there who are in need of hearing your story, of hearing how God has entered into your life and changed you from one way to another way. That's a testimony. And that's what we see Paul doing, is he's going out there knowing that they could start throwing rocks while he's talking to them. And they're not little rocks, they're stones. But he chooses to go out there because he knows that his story might change someone. It might affect someone and in turn save their soul for eternity. Why is that important? Because there is a heaven, there is a hell, there is a future creation everything's going to be remade. We're either with Jesus forever or we're not with Jesus forever. Right? There's the reality of that. And so when we share our testimonies, we have the unique opportunity to save someone's soul. Not that we save them, but that we bring Jesus to them and he saves them. That he's the one that draws them to him. But Jesus uses our story, our testimony, to build a bridge to help them understand the gospel a little more. It's really hard for me to go up to someone and say, "Jesus died for you." And they're like, "Okay, what does that mean?" But when you explain to them, "I was this way, Jesus entered into my life, and now I'm this way. Now I'm changed." Especially when it's people that you know, friendships, relationships, people in your workplace that you have hard relationships with. Maybe you were one way and you caused a lot of the damage in those relationships, right? Maybe the way you were pre-Christ was the thing that hurt those relationships, but now Christ has come into your life and you've changed. You have a unique opportunity to go back and seek forgiveness and say, "I was this way. Forgive me. Christ has come into my life. Now I'm this way. Now I'm changed." And so we see Paul says, "I used to persecute Christians. I used to beat them. I used to imprison them. Jesus encountered me on my way to persecute more Christians in another city, and now I'm not the same." And he gives the opportunity for them to hear the gospel. So God's given you a testimony to use and to share. And this story of how God has worked in your life is something that can draw other people to Jesus. Your story of how Jesus has changed you can be a tool to use to draw people to Jesus. So, the telling of what God has done in your life is something that you can use. But how do I use it, right? It's super confusing. Sometimes you're like, "I don't have the right words. I don't know how to formulate a conversation with someone where I can just say, 'Oh yeah, and I used to be like this.'" Well, we look at Paul, and it says that he explains who he was pre-Jesus, right? He connects with the people. These are some characteristics of how he brings up the gospel into his conversations. Well, he connects with the people. If I'm talking to Jordan, I'm like, "Jordan, what do you do for work?" And he says, "Oh, I'm a trash man. I pick up the trash, throw the trash away, push the trash, lift the trash, put it into a bigger box, take it out, take it into a little box, and then put it into another box all day, pretty much." And I say, that's awesome. I also take the trash to a box from my box in my house. And then I take it to a bigger box outside. I connect with him somehow. I mean, that's probably the worst way to connect with him. But I connect with him somehow. And then I can say, obviously Jordan's going to be like, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a pastor. I used to not be. I mean, I actually didn't want to do this. I wanted to be a zoologist working with reptiles, or herpetologist studying that. I actually got to college, I was thinking about doing psychology to make money because it pays more. But I ended up being a pastor, and he says, well, how did that happen? Because you didn't want to, right? Well, I say, well, I was one way. I used to, smoke a lot. I used to drink a lot when I was a teenager. And then I went to El Salvador. My dad shipped me off with him, obviously. We went there, and I was encountered by two teenage girls. They were like 13 and 12, or 12 and 11, one of the two. But I was a 16-year-old. And they told me the story about how Jesus had changed their life. And seeing that their lives were in difficult situations, really hard things that I won't repeat, but really difficult things, I'm sure you can imagine, third world country, and they were suffering a lot of stuff. And they told me how they still loved Jesus, and Jesus loved them. That was the first time that I encountered Jesus in a real way, in a way where I saw that he changed lives and worked in lives that was outside of my church experience. And I took that hold of that, and that changed my life. I saw Jesus for who he really is, not for who I assumed he was or for whom people acted like he was, because oftentimes people don't act right, and they claim Jesus. And you get a bad interpretation of who Jesus is when you watch people. But when you learn about who Jesus is through the way that Jesus explains who he is, you get a better image of him. And so I got a good image of Jesus. My life was changed, and I said, okay, what do you want me to do? Now that I'm different, and it was the slow process of him leading me into pastoring. So what I did was I explained who I was before Jesus. I explained the moment of the encounter in El Salvador. I encountered two young girls who explained to me who Jesus was. And then the result of the encounter was that I am changed. I am someone different. And we see that with Paul. He says, not only did I encounter this bright light, but he told me to do something different. He said, I'm sending you out to the Gentiles. I'm sending you to go do something. And so Paul shares his testimony with these people. And the way that we can share our testimony, explain who we were, explain how we encountered Jesus, explain how we're changed. It's three really simple things. And you'll find out that oftentimes you might describe it a little differently. You might share it a little differently based on who you're talking to. But the important part is that we're sharing our testimony, like Paul. That when we're encountering difficult situations, we interject gospel moments. We find opportunities where we can share how Jesus has changed us. And oftentimes it happens in relationships, right? We're not going to be put in front of a crowd of people because we're being arrested and they want to beat us. I mean, unless you do something to deserve it, that might be a different story. But when we're in opportunities in our relationships with our friends, with our workers, co-workers, you have opportunities, like Paul, to present gospel moments, to present your testimony, to share it in a way that can bring someone to Jesus. And then one day they'll talk about a testimony to someone else and say about how this person came and shared their story with me, and it, like me, with those two girls, they shared their story with me, and it changed my life. I mean, the fact that you guys are sitting in here in a church happened because two young preteen girls decided to talk to me and share about how Jesus changed them. And so we see that our testimony has power, that our story has power, and Jesus wants to use each one of your stories to bring someone to Jesus, to bring someone to him, to help open a door for them to receive the gospel. So this is my application. It's really simple. It's one, look at difficult moments in your life and others as opportunities to point things back to Jesus. That means if you're going on a great time with your life, like oftentimes I am, and there's someone going through a hard time, guess what? That's a perfect opportunity to share the gospel. When you're going through a hard time and someone says, why are you okay? I would be crumbled in my bed, curled up in a ball, crying all day, but you seem okay, you can function. It's a perfect time to share the gospel, right? Look for those opportunities in your life throughout your day to interject the gospel. The second is that you use your unique position in life as a doorway to connect with others about Jesus. Use your job, use your skills, your knowledge, your training. You know, I can walk into a room and talk to people who are educated because I can say I have a master's degree, right? And it opens a door for me to be able to have a conversation with them. I struggle going into a door of PhD people and saying, you know, oh, I have a master's degree, guys. Can I get into this conversation? They're like, no. But we use our unique positions in life as doorways to connect with people about Jesus. Whatever that is. If you're a trucker, which a lot of you guys do something in that industry or a blue-collar work, use that as an opportunity to open doors for the gospel. And then the third is use your testimony of how Jesus changed your life as a way to share the gospel and to encourage others. Right? If someone's going through a hard time, have I ever been through a hard time? Yeah. How did I get through that hard time? Well, for the past 12 years, 13 years, it's been Jesus. Before that, it was probably beer or something else. And so when I can explain to someone how I went through a hard time or how I endured a hard time, it's an opportunity for me to encourage them and present the gospel. So we look for moments as gospel opportunities like Paul does. Even in the midst of people wanting to kill him, he says, let me share to you about Jesus real quick, and then do what you want. But let me share Jesus with you. So look at difficult moments as opportunities. Use your unique position in life as a doorway to connect with others. And then use your testimony of how Jesus changed your life as a way to share the gospel and encourage others.